You're listening to another episode of the Inspire Health podcast. Thank you for joining us. This episode features a wonderful friend and colleague of mine, Loken Reznic. If your child is a picky eater or dealing with learning or developmental disorders, then you will not want to miss this episode. Loken breaks down strategies and solutions that address the underlying issues behind these concerns in a way that makes therapy engaging, motivating, challenging, and fun. This was a super fun interview, and Loken leaves us with so many great strategies that you can incorporate with your kids right away. Welcome to the Inspire Health podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges, and we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode. Today with us we have Loken Reznic. Loken received her master's degree in speech and language pathology from the University of Wisconsin and is the founder of Loken Reznic Therapy Services, which is a unique facility built around functionality and motivation. Her current clinical practice focuses on babies, infants, and toddlers. Loken is dedicated to providing families with an eclectic, holistic, and thorough approach to feeding and speech and language challenges. Her clinic offers play-based therapy services and sensory motor gyms where they conduct evaluations and treatments. Their gyms also encourage movement to enhance self-regulation and attending behaviors. Loken has a whack of extra additional courses. I think more than anybody I know, she continually continues taking courses over and over again on all sorts of stuff to improve her skills. And she has a special interest in feeding, myofunctional therapy, motor speech disorders, and early intervention. Loken, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thank you so very much for having me. This is really fun. I'm very passionate about what I do, and I know Jason is too, so I'm excited to see what he's putting together for all of you.
Yeah, Loken and I can often get together and have talks on all sorts of things and go on for hours. So I'm really excited to pick your brain on some of these things today. So for people that aren't too aware yet of what exactly speech and language pathologists do, can you give a little bit of a breakdown on just what kind of work you do? What are the kind of kids that are coming in to see you in practice? What are they working with? How would a parent know when to bring their child in?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because a lot of the time people say, oh, you're a speech therapist, so you must help kids with their S's and R's. I had a speech therapist when I was young and they helped me with my R. Now I can say rabbit. And I'm like, that's awesome. But we do a lot more than that. And in fact, I rarely see kids for just S's and R's. We really do a whole array of things. And that's why I really do recommend, when you are going to see a speech and language pathologist, that you find someone who does have a lot of background and experience working in, the area in which you need, because speech language pathologists work anywhere from like infant feeding in the NICU to, adults like post-stroke with Parkinson's, working on voice, working on aphasia. So really it's quite a spectrum, and you really got to find somebody who knows what they're doing. So for me, I specialize, well, actually, I can't say specialize, but
Special interest.
I have a special interest in, as Jason mentioned, babies, toddlers. I really like to work with the younger population, because what I'm finding the longer I practice is the earlier I can get to them, the quicker we can resolve the issue, and the quicker they can go on and thrive and develop at their optimal level, which is, what we as parents all strive for our kids. So I used to see a lot of kids for articulation and language. And now again, I'm seeing babies with feeding disorders. I do a lot of see a lot of kids with feeding disorders or feeding delays. And, we're working on kind of figuring out the oral structure, and we're looking at seeing how the muscles of the mouth are moving and functioning. And we want to be forming that for best speech and feeding. And once we can kind of work on that, we set them up for success, and they sort of thrive in all the other areas. But a speech language pathologist, going back to the original question, a lot of the things you'll find we work on is language, early language and development, so like a late talker, articulation, like I'd mentioned, motor speech disorders, so things like apraxia, where kids can't really sequence and coordinate their sounds to form words, things like fluency and stuttering, alternative and augmentative communication for kids that don't have that vocal output. We work on getting them a good system that can help them communicate. So every kind of communication, literacy, phonology, and then, as I mentioned, that feeding piece as well. Some SLPs are now interested in feeding and doing that oral facial myology.
Yeah, I'm interested. So, yeah, definitely a lot more than learning how to say rabbit.
Yes.
Well, or I think a lot of times they think, like, if your child's just having difficulties, maybe even with a lisp or something like that, and sort of how do you work with it? So it would be something you guys would look at, but basically there's a lot more to the spectrum. And this is partly why I want to do these interviews, because a lot of times there's so much aid available that people just don't know that is at their fingertips. And
Right.
so if we can kind of share that information when parents are having, when the children are having some sort of issues, and the parents then start to have an idea of where they can take their kids to get evaluated and get treated appropriately. And like you said, this is the same for a lot of things. If you can get early intervention, it's like the way the child's brain is making connections and changing and developing so fast. That's when you want to try and get as much on top of things as you can early on. You had
Exactly.
mentioned around feeding delays and feeding disorders. That's a big one I've seen come up a lot too the last while. Like what are people coming in? Like how would a parent know that their child's having feeding delays or feeding disorders? Is this if they can't latch properly with infants, or what are you seeing and what are you finding usually plays into it?
So for the most part, I'd say we see a lot of toddlers who are quote unquote picky eaters. I don't like using the word picky eater, because as a speech and language pathologist, I think that the terms we use around our kids are very smart and they pick up a lot of what we say. And if you're calling your son or daughter a picky eater, then they're going to think that they are a picky eater. And we don't want them to think that. We want them to
Very
think they're
true.
an adventurous eater. So again, I don't like to use that term, but that term is used quite frequently between professionals and parents alike. So we see a lot of those kids where they come in and they're just like, my kid will only eat 2 things, 3 things, 5 things. And every single meal is a struggle. I just can't take this anymore. What do I do? So we see a lot of those kids. Some of those kids are neurotypically developing. Some of them have autism spectrum disorder. Really, we see kids with anything going on. They're all sort of similar issues there.
Yeah, and definitely create some concerns for parents, because I swear, as a parent, I'm a parent too, and I know you are as well. And it's like the things that tend to stress parents out almost more than anything are if your child is not eating or not sleeping or not going to the bathroom properly. If those things start to happen, then we start to kind of wonder what's up. So when kids eat well, I know from my own perspective, I'm always really happy when my children feel like they are eating a good, balanced, nutritious, and I know they're getting all of the nutrients that they need. So when they do come in and they're only eating, certain textures or certain key foods that they've decided are the only things they feel comfortable with, they will likely start to run into some other downstream problems with nutritional deficiencies. So when they come and see someone like yourself, how do you work with feeding delays or feeding disorders, what's your sort of piece on that? I know how we might look at it from trying to balance nutrient levels and stuff, but it's a whole different thing from the habitual passage of it. How do you start to work on that?
That's right. And so one of the biggest things that I get is like parents will say to me like, well, we've seen a naturopath or we've seen a nutritionist or a dietitian, and the one issue that we have, and this is when sometimes I think it is better to see a speech and language pathologist or an occupational therapist first that is doing feeding, is they'll say, they have these great ideas, but like my kid won't eat any of that. Like, my naturopath said, take these supplements. Well, my kid won't. Or the dietitian said, here's a really great balanced meal that you can try. Well, my kid won't eat it. So what do I do? So for me, the first thing is to look at, so I do a sensory motor approach to feeding. So you want to look at what's going on in the sensory system. You want to look at what's going on motorically. So again, I go back to always the structure and the function of the mouth and the different parts of the mouth and how they're working. Obviously we also want to take into consideration the environment, the parenting styles, the behaviors associated. But again, like everything else, this is a team approach because every single piece of that is a very, very important piece of the puzzle. And I always tell parents too, feeding, it's not a quick fix, right? Like when you bring me a 5-year-old who has only eaten 3 foods for 2 years, like, I wish I had a magic wand, but it's a process. It's a process. But we talk about a lot of things. Like I said, first we'll kind of do that initial assessment to see what's going on in that mouth, because a lot of the time I do see some issues with chewing, with being able to even like bring the food to form a cohesive bolus that's safe and efficient to swallow properly. All those things are things that I look at functionally to make sure that the child can chew and manipulate the foods. Because what I find is that a lot of these kids, it sort of stemmed from somewhere. And my favorite thing about my job and what I do in every single assessment is find out, why is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
And everyone should be doing that, but not everybody does do that. But it's really important because we can't really help this kid until we know what's happening. So we can go through a whole behavioral approach for feeding with this child, but if the child isn't eating a certain texture because they choked on that texture when they were little, because they don't actually know how to safely and efficiently manage that texture, then guess what? They're not going to eat that texture. And sure, you can, you can force feed them, but that's not going to have a lasting effect.
Yeah, that's hugely important because it comes back to labeling. So it's like when we start to think about our children being picky eaters, like you said, kids just don't do stuff for the sake of doing it for the most part. There's usually motivation behind it. And so like you said, it's not really that they're picky. It's that for whatever reason, they weren't able to probably manage different foods in a way that was comfortable for them. So now what happens is that can actually even trigger a bit of a fight or flight response in them when they do take it, which kind of aggravates them even more, right? Throws them out of their ability to self-regulate too.
Yes.
So,
Yes. And I talk about that a lot in like my feeding workshops as well. I say, like neurons that fire together, wire together. And so a lot of the time these kids, just like you said, they had this event that happened, and whether the parents like know about that event or not doesn't matter, because it's about how that child felt at the time. And when they had some sort of an episode, presumably whether it was when they were a baby and they had reflux, or whether it was them trying solids for the first time and it went down the wrong way, whatever it was meaningful to them, and it has a lasting effect. So we have to kind of figure out why, and then we can help retrain the brain as to, no, this is safe because now I can chew this food and it's safe now, and now we can continue on this path.
mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I think that's great. So retraining eating. How do you even start that process? Like when a child is really stuck on a certain few foods, what are some of the strategies that you can start to motivate that child to want to even explore other foods? Because sometimes it takes, it's not just doing it once and going, nope, my child tried it, my child hates it, they're not going to do it, so we just go back to the regular stuff. Usually takes a while. And like you had mentioned when you're talking about Hebb's law with the neurons that fire together, wire together. It's also why it takes a little bit more time to rewire the brain. You have to,
Mhm.
and the main thing that does that is the creating another habituation. It's creating another routine, and that happens through repetition. So, how do you
Mhm.
start the process with parents when they come in? Like, what would it look like? What would be some examples that you might sort of do?
So again, the first thing I would do is an assessment. So we kind of look at the whole picture, and then depending on the child, because every child is so unique, and I can't stress this enough, because so many times people, they just want to know, like, how long is this going to take? Like what are our steps? And like, I don't know, because again, I treat every child as an individual because of all these factors. Everyone is so different. So it's an answer that I can't often give, but I can tell you definitely how we start the process and what that process entails. And so again, once we figure out, if there's something, structurally, functionally sort of in the way, we want to address that first and foremost.
Mhm.
But working on rewiring the brain, and that habituation, like you said, that's usually the more lengthier process. And again, depending on the kids, some kids we'll get it pretty quick, but we really do find a lot of really, really fun ways to play with our food.
Right.
um,
Yeah. Good
so
point.
yeah, I always tell parents, like, one of the first things I say is like, get messy, and a lot of them are like, oh, what? You want me to do what? Play with my food? What? And I'm like, yeah, you got to play with the food. Food is fun. The most important piece of all of this is the food exploration. So if a child can't, like, I have children that come in and they see a food and they'll vomit, like it can get to that point. And so, we need to get them comfortable with that food. So they need to be able to see that food. They need to be able to interact with that food before putting anything in their mouth. We need to make sure they're comfortable with it. And I give parents an example a lot of the time. I think it was Marsha Dunn Klein. She's an amazing, amazing feeding therapist. And she, I think, was the one who wrote an article called something like Everything's like a grasshopper. And I just really like the analogy, because she talks about how she went to Mexico and she was with a family and they invited her for dinner, and she said, oh, that's so nice, and they were eating grasshoppers because they do. And she was like, oh my gosh, like, I don't eat grasshoppers. And so she talks about she took her tortilla and she took a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of the grasshopper leg and put a ton of guacamole in and everything else. And then, she started eating it and she's like, okay, that's not that bad. And then she took another piece and again, she felt it in her hand. She put it in her tortilla. So she was having a sensory experience with it, and she was able to do more and more. And then she realized, like, okay, this isn't so bad. I can do this. And it's just really important, because we're saying to these children, like, it's just a grape, it's just a pea, it's just whatever. But to them, it could be a spider, it could be, it could be a flame of fire. Like, this food is scary to them, and we have to give them credit for that. And I think that that's really hard for some people to understand, but I think it's a really, really important piece of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part. And when you start to make it fun, you get them out of fight or flight again. So now you start to rewire the context of the situation so that now that child's pairing eating and specific things with lightness and humor and fun. And so that helps them get out of that fight or flight, which then naturally starts to open the brain to new experiences too. So
Exactly.
I love it. I think it's really fun. I think a lot of times, probably as parents, we all need to play with our food a little bit more at times.
Yeah, and so like in our feeding groups, we do a lot of these like what I'll say for some of these kids, depending on their stages, we will put them in a group and we'll put them with some other kids because it's also really nice for them to have other people that they can, we always we really create our groups in a way that we are looking for specific matches. So we never want one child to feel like they're way below other kids, and we don't want anyone to feel like they're way above. Like we want to usually find somebody that's below in one way and above in another way, and then the other kid who's below in one way is above in another way, and that sort of thing. And that way we have every kid modeling. Like, so one kid might be great with touching the food, and that's really great for another kid to see, and then the other kid might be good at eating it, and the other kid, you know what I mean? So but we do these activities that are just really fun. I've got the craziest, wackiest ideas, and and we just do them all, and it's actually a blast. I'm
I
sure
think
you
that
can
sounds
imagine,
great.
Jason.
I might want to come and sit in on one of those.
You're welcome anytime.
You had also, you were talking a little bit about how the gyms encourage movement to enhance self-regulation and attending behaviors. Can you talk
Yes.
a little bit about that? Because really, self-regulation is the information coming down on self-regulation is showing that it is probably the single most important skill to develop for ultimate success in our world. So in my mind, it's like anything that we can do to help our children self-regulate, really important. So like even when you're talking about the feeding and creating play around it, that's usually an aspect of what's going to probably help to self-regulate, because you're helping that child get out of fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
How else does speech and language pathology and the way that you're incorporating things at your clinic help with self-regulation?
So as a speech language pathologist, I definitely can't say I'm an expert at self-regulation, but I have had I've been lucky enough to have worked with occupational therapists my entire career. And when I went into private practice, it was a must for me that we build our space to fit the needs of these kids to, be able to help them achieve these goals, and that we had occupational therapists on staff that really, are the experts in this field and can help us. But what I've learned from them is just like unbelievable. And I use it in every single one of my speech and language sessions. So we use, like you had said initially, like we have swings set up in our clinic, and we use them a lot for speech. So just even, playing on the swing and swinging back and forth, that vestibular movement really encourages vocal output. So we do that also for kids that are feeling a little bit unsure about being with me, like, oh, what's she going to make me do, and feeling a little bit of pressure. It's a really great way to take the pressure off and make it fun. So we use swings. We have lots of different sensory tools at the clinic, like a lot of weighted items. We have vibration. And I just find that if we can get these kids into their zone of proximal development, they can learn so much better and so much faster than if they were just sitting there. Like, I've never been a speech language pathologist to sit at a table and chair and just like drill a child, because I'm bored. I can't
Right.
imagine how this like 4-year-old feels if they could even sit there. And I don't expect the 4-year-old to sit there, because that's not what 4-year-olds are supposed to do, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So, we really have a lot of fun, and we encourage a lot of movement, a lot of like deep pressure, heavy work, and a lot of those different things that you'll learn from occupational therapists really help kids stay calm and focused. And what I find is that if we can do speech stuff. And then after, I'd be like, okay, if you do all of this, we can go play in the gym for the last little bit. And we go in the
Lauren,
gym.
you cut out there for a sec. Let me bring
Oh,
you back just so I
okay.
get that piece.
Okay.
I think it was right when you were about to make your point, and then we'll clip this section out.
Okay. What was I saying?
You were going to wait when if we can just.
Okay. Oh man. If we could just, okay, wait, what I was talking about, like, what part did I say? What was the last thing I said? Do you remember?
I can't remember the exact last part that you were at. It only clipped out probably for about maybe 5 seconds in between there.
Oh, okay. Okay. So did I said that when I was working in Minnesota? Did I say
Yeah,
that?
so maybe start there
Okay, I'll
around when
start
you were
there.
working with
Okay.
Minnesota, and then we'll clip it out.
Okay. Okay. So when I was working at a great private clinic in Minnesota and I was sitting at my table and chair being a speech therapist, I would work with these kids, they do a great job, and then they had 5 minutes at the end of the session to play if they did well. So we'd go into the gym and, I'm always being a speech therapist. It doesn't stop just because we're in a gym playing. So, I'd keep asking them the questions and working on the same stuff. And I'm like, what happened to everything you just knew? It just flew out the window. And I was just like so amazed and really like dumbfounded because I'm like, no wonder your mom says you're not doing this at home or you're not doing this in the park. Like, you can only do this at a table and chair. So I just find that if we can bring that movement and that real life to our sessions, our kids are able to pick it up faster and they're able to generalize and they're able to keep it.
Yeah, and like you said, bringing it into real life. It's how do you integrate stuff, not just in a one-dimensional environment, but how do you integrate it into the rest of your life functionally? So again, it's like it crosses over with so many different things. I think of it like no different than when people are at a gym trying to work a specific muscle, but not actually integrate it in a very functional way that they can use in the real world, right? Outside of it be working in that one area.
Yeah.
So you incorporate a lot of play then, and play therapy then as it sounds like a basis for the treatment model that you guys use.
Yes,
And there's been
definitely.
tons of research on the benefits of play therapy. What do you
Yeah.
find kind of the primary thing around that then? Is it that it relaxes the child to a point that they then open up, their learning starts to improve from part of that just relaxation, self-regulation response that comes with play?
Definitely, I think that's a huge piece. Additionally, I think it just helps make a child feel more comfortable. Like, when they come into my office, like my office is pretty fun, but, I'm a new person. It's a new space. They don't really know what I'm going to do. They don't know what to anticipate. And so, they might be a little bit nervous, as one would be. And if we can just start off by playing and, like having fun, like it builds our rapport so quickly. Like, sometimes it takes obviously longer, but for most kids, we could develop a rapport really, really fast. And they learn to trust me quickly. And they learn that, I'm helping them and I'm not going to be hurting them. And so it just really sets the foundation for that. And once we're there, like you said, like play is something they know, it's something they're good at, and they can feel confident with it. And when we're playing, again, we can just more easily generalize the skill. So this is where I always say, like, this is where, this is a good speech therapist. Like a good speech therapist should be able to do whatever the child wants to do and still be able to incorporate your own goals, right? So it's very different from when I first graduated from grad school, and it was like, oh, I have my list here of everything I'm going to do in a session. And let me tell you, I learned pretty quickly that doesn't work, because surprisingly, none of those kids had the same agenda as I did, and they didn't want to play the game I did. And everyone sat around there like, okay, when's this over? And so if you can throw that at the window and you just start to know your games and your toys, and and your strengths and what you have, then you let the child lead, and you jump in, and that's what makes a good therapist, somebody that, you know, can be flexible like that. But again, I think that following the child's lead, and I've taken a couple of trainings and certification. One of them is the DIR floor time approach to therapy, and I think it's totally awesome. And when I learned it, I was like, yeah, duh, I'm doing this. Like, you know, like you got to do this. So it just made sense to me. But like you said, Jason, there is a lot more research now and a lot more information about why this is so great. And for me, when kids started crying to leave instead of crying to come, I said, okay, I think this is working.
I love it when you take a course and it feels like that. It reminds me of reading like a really good book that you kind of already knew, but you love the book because it just reinforced what you already knew.
Yeah, those are always great.
Nice. So a couple other things I wanted to pinpoint. There's a lot of stuff coming up around tongue-tied, and how does that play into things? When would a parent even have an idea that something like that might be going on? What might be some symptoms of a child that has, because it's not necessarily like we might have a picture of a tongue-tied child where it's like completely strapped down and there's no movement. There's variability to it, right? There's nuances in it. So can you tell me a little bit about that? Because I know that's an area that you focus on a little bit more too.
Yes, I'm very passionate about it because it is coming out a lot more now, and there's some really positive things people have to say and some really negative things people have to say as well. So I think that one of the negative things is that there's unfortunately still not a really, really great way for everybody to be on the same page about it. And because nobody's really learning about it in school, you know, like I've spoken to a lot of dentists about this, orthodontists, pediatricians, SLPs, OTs, and everybody says like, okay, yeah, it was like 5 minutes. We learned like, you know, if it attaches to the tip of the tongue, then they have a tongue tie, and then we release it, and then that's great. But what we're finding now is that it doesn't have to be that restricted to still be an issue. And a lot of the studies that were done in the past were all about the ones that were those interior ties right at the tip of the tongue. And so a lot of the research from back then is not completely accurate by some people's, you know, what some people are saying now. So there are tons of articles being written now, and there's lots of research being done now. But again, the classification system is still new and not generalized around the world and interdisciplinary. So it's a bit of an issue, but
just for people that might not know exactly what tongue-tied is, so it's when the flap of the skin that's underneath the tongue and it goes too far forward, and it used to be diagnostic, it would hit the tip of the tongue, then that was considered tongue-tied. But now they're kind of finding different degrees of where that actually can go. It doesn't have to be all the way to the tip of the tongue. It might be a little bit back, but if it's restricting movement, then it needs to be worked in some facet.
Yes, thank you, Jason, for clarifying it. That's great. So basically, tongue tie is called ankyloglossia. And what it is it's when the frenum, that piece of skin under the tongue, is tethered. So it's also referred to as tethered oral tissues. And previously, it was sort of those anterior ties that were right at the front that were being looked at. And now we're seeing, now we're talking a lot about posterior ties, which are just further back. And if you have an anterior tie, you literally can't do anything, including sticking your tongue out. And so the problem is that a lot of people were trying to diagnose this just by sticking your tongue out. But if you have a posterior tie that's further back, you can stick your tongue out fine. You can extend it. That's not the problem. The problem is bringing it up to the top, like to the palate, and bringing it side to side. And both of these skills are, they're required for proper feeding and speech development. So it really is something that we do, in my opinion, need to be looking more at. And I'm looking more at that. I've done a lot of training. And I think that's the thing, is the people who have done the training, they understand it and they're able to see this, but the people who haven't, what I like to say is, we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And so they just, in my opinion, they don't know, they haven't learned. And so it's hard because a lot of people are getting a lot of misinformation, and I think it's really causing a bad name.
So for what would be some of the primary symptoms? And so you said that could be at the root of why someone might be a quote unquote picky eater, or if they're having some developmental delays in their speech or is there any sort of telltale signs that you would find that would trigger parents to want to go and get it checked right away?
Yeah, so starting off as babies, a lot of babies who are having a lot of reflux and they're having a lot of difficulty breastfeeding. If the moms are in a lot of pain breastfeeding, these are big symptoms and signs.
Which is huge.
And it happens a lot, right? It really happens a lot. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it's as simple as doing a procedure, some therapy, and we're all good to go. And so I just think it's very important that, moms are aware of this and families are aware of this, because, again, it's just something that happens so often. And the problem now is finding people that can help you and finding that network of support to do all of the right things. And I would like to take a minute to, tell you what I think is sort of the right path, because I think it is still so unknown, and there's a lot of debate about this. But for me, I think it's really important that someone's doing a functional assessment of the tie, not just looking at it. They need to be seeing how that tongue is moving, what the range of motion is. For oral work, sometimes osteopathy and other body work is going to help, because this baby now has developed a lot of tension and a lot of compensating factors. And people say, but it's just a newborn. But this develops in 18 weeks in utero. And so they've actually been in this habit and having a incorrect tongue rest posture and incorrect sucking pattern for quite a while, even when they're born. And so I find if we can do a little bit of pre-therapy and we can get this baby to a point, then the release provider, the one who's actually doing the release and cutting that tie, they can do a much better job, because all the muscles are relaxed and they're free, and they can kind of, get the whole thing. And then we do some therapy afterwards as well. And this really creates the most optimal results.
Wonderful. Yeah, it wasn't an area that was on my radar as much until I really started talking to you about it. And we would often think, if I saw reflux and feeding issues, especially feeding issues, a lot of times what we would look at from an osteopathic perspective would be a lot of times in the way that the baby would exit the birth canal, they would jam the occiput, and that might kind of irritate the 12th cranial nerve, which is the hypoglossal, which innervates the tongue. So then all of a sudden they can't actually latch properly because they can't use their tongue properly. But this is just more of a different structural perspective on looking at that too. So it gives an idea why it's so important to kind of get things assessed in different ways to see ultimately what piece is playing into it. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I think that's a really important piece, because it does set up in motion early on. Because, I mean, again, like you said, reflux. So it's like, if a child has reflux, it's not uncommon that they end up on some type of medication early on for reflux. And if it's not needed, then, and you can get to the root of it, then by all means, check these different things out first before you start some of the medications that often the child doesn't require.
Right. So sometimes, so that's when you would see it in babies. And then you can also see it sometimes babies breastfeed fine. And usually it's because the mom has an oversupply of milk. But then maybe they'll want to switch to a bottle and they'll have a hard time with the bottle. Or maybe it's when they start solids and they'll have a hard time with solids. Or maybe it's when they start talking and they're having a hard time with certain sounds. So again, it's not something that you just see at one time in life. It sort of progresses. And again, in everybody, it's different. But those are some of the times that you'll notice, like, seems harder than it should be. And you might wonder why.
Yeah. Yeah. And then go and get it checked.
Right. Yeah.
A couple other things here before, I know we're coming up on time and I want to be respectful of your time, but as far as learning and behavior goes, when say children are having behavioral problems, behavioral disorders, anything along these lines, learning.
Yeah.
So from an SLP perspective, how would you look at learning and behavior disorders or learning and behavior disabilities? I know for me, I might look at it from a biochemical perspective and from a nutrient perspective, but from your perspective, when a child's maybe having outbursts or learning disabilities of some sort, where does your head kind of go? What are the pieces that need to be looked at from your perspective?
Okay, right. So for me, behavior sort of equals communication. Like, I like to think that no child is bad. No child wants to be bad. So what is happening that we're seeing these behaviors? And a lot of the time it's an inability to communicate how they feel, what they think. And because of that inability to communicate, they're now displaying all these behaviors. So for me, for all those kids that come in with the behaviors, or the parents are complaining that they're doing this and that, and they don't want them to be, first I look at how are they communicating? Like, are they able to get my attention? Are they able to tell me if something's wrong? Are they able to ask me a question if they're not sure? And a lot of the time, these kids are having difficulty with somewhere down the road with some of those things, and they don't know what to do. So they try to get attention a different way, either getting out of a situation or kind of getting attention to get what they finally need.
Exactly. And you think about it even from an adult perspective, what creates probably some of the most conflict in our adult relationships is miscommunication. So it only makes sense that as a child who's, not completely wired yet to kind of even regulate properly or optimally, that's going to probably put them over the edge way faster than it would even for an adult. And we know how much that can bother us when communication is an issue. Yeah, it's so great too, because it's just also so good for parents to hear that there's usually a reason for why we see behavior come out. Rarely, and it doesn't take away from the fact that as a parent, sometimes it can be completely frustrating and overwhelming and exhausting. I know that. But if we know that there are reasons for why it's happening, they're not just a bad kid or a picky kid, it gives us a lot more resources to be able to look for another answer, right? And have a little bit more compassion when we do see them flipping out and whatnot too. So I think that's a wonderful piece around communication. So then as you help to restore their ability to communicate, often you will find that nervous system settles down a little bit more, frustration calms down a little bit more, and then you often find that behavior starts to normalize a little bit better.
Yeah, I do. I find that if we can give them a means to get their point across, we usually see, better overall behavior.
Awesome. Last thing I wanted to pick your brain on was your perspective as an SLP and as a parent, and seeing lots of children over the years. What would be some of the top do's and do nots that you could tell or mention to parents so that they've got an idea? Because sometimes we just, as parents, have no idea what really we should be doing or shouldn't be doing that might be creating some troubles down the road, or that we should be doing that could pave the way to make things a lot easier. What would be some of your top few do's or do nots for parents?
Well, my first thing that I do like that I really like to do as a parent with all the experience that I have working with kids is I really try to make things fun and enjoyable. And when something isn't, I stop and I think, what's happening? What's gone wrong? Because then I can usually come back and try it in another way. And I think that, you know, that's one thing for me as a parent that I really do like every single day. Because it's not, well, not to say it's not supposed to be hard. It's hard.
Yeah, and
But
any parent I think would agree.
yeah. But in terms of like eating a meal, like, listen, like the reality of every day is we've got stuff to do. We got things going on. And so we can't take forever. And that's a lot of where my frustration comes in. Cause
Yeah.
I'm just like, all right, hurry up. Like, let's go. But you know, when you're taking the time and you don't have somewhere to go right away and you're taking the time to spend with your child, whether it's eating a meal, reading a book, playing a game, you know, how's that going? Like, are you getting a lot of back and forth communication? Are you both happy? Are you having fun? Is everyone sort of asking questions? Are you on the same page? And this is where we can see speech and language development flourish. And this is where we can also see, like, if these things aren't happening, then it might be something we want to look into, you know, because a lot of these things do happen, you know, developmental, like, sort of like natural development is just really cool. And you just watch one thing turn into another and turn into another. And if you're hitting a roadblock somewhere and it's not natural and it's not really happening, then you might just wonder, you know, why. And there's so many great professionals out there that can help you. And, you know, some people will call me and they say, you know what, I'll talk to them on the phone and they say, I've got these issues, and do you think it's a problem or not? And sometimes I say, you know what, not really. Like, it sounds pretty typical to me, but if you're concerned, come in, let's have an assessment, and, you know, you'll feel better, right? And then they can come in and I say, you know what, they're doing great. Here's some tips, like, see ya. And that's great. And if not, then we can give them some tips and get them back on track. So I think it's always a good idea if you're questioning anything. I think parents have gut reactions and they know what's up more than anybody else. And so I think you as a parent need to listen to your gut and not listen to other people, because a lot of people tell you what they think they want you to hear. And they'll say, you know, everyone that comes into my office, but everybody said this was okay. And so I kept waiting and waiting. And if you don't feel like it's okay, that's the most important piece.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the biggest thing. But in terms of like feeding and speech and language development, I think that just exposing your kids to as much as possible early on is really the way to go. So, you know, I had my son exposed to every single type of food. I actually made it a point to every time I went to the grocery store to buy a couple new items, just so that I could expose him to it. And whether we played with it or ate it, it was always there. And I think that's really great. And to be able to bring your kids to the grocery store and let them pick out some things that they want too. So again, you're interacting, they're interacting. I think these are really great things. And when you're at the grocery store, let's talk about what's happening. You know, you can label all of the different things you see. You can talk about what's happening, and these are all really important things too, you know, like just to be able to talk to your child, for them to hear it. Repetition is so important for these little kids. And so I will say that for some kids who have like a motor speech delay, you know, sometimes there are some different strategies. Sometimes less is more for these kids, but for typically developing kids, really you just want to tell them as much as possible and have them hear that.
I think that's great advice. Incorporate more play, make things fun. When things aren't working, start to question it a little bit more. And then your comment around repetition when it's applicable.
Yeah. And also talking at the level of your child, I think, is a really big one. And again, it kind of goes with play, but just to say, when you're playing with a child, get your phone away, get down on the floor with them. You need to interact. You need to get that back and forth. They need it from you. You need it from them. And that's another really big one for me.
Yeah, that's a huge one, I think, too, is when you are going to be with your child and you're going to play with them, take the time to be just very present with them, and definitely like take the phone away, put the computer away, like be there, because they know, and it's not the same. They would be better off to have 15 minutes of really quality, direct communication and eye-to-eye contact and seeing all the facial changes and everything than to have an hour of kind of half there, half doing something on your phone and doing work. So I know myself, if I'm ever trying to get something done and my daughter wants my attention, she will come and literally grab my face and pull my face. Daddy, look at me, look at me. So then I know that's it. Computer's down, time to go and play with her, do something else. They will tell you, we just have to listen.
Exactly.
Lauren, that was wonderful. I so appreciate your time and being able to talk to you. How can people learn a little bit more about you? Where can they find you? Anything else, any other projects you've got going on now? What's the best way people can get a hold of you if they need to?
So our website is www.laurenreznic.com. And you can find lots of information there about what we do, who we are, and all that fun stuff. You'll also find there some of the different groups that we do and some of the parent info sessions. So we run typically, we try to do the monthly parent info sessions, and Jason did one of ours, which was awesome. We try to get just different really great professionals in talking about different things. A lot of the time we run them ourselves and talk about things like self-regulation, picky eating, early language development. And we just ask that you make a small donation to Sick Kids Foundation for these. So they're not expensive, and they're usually on Wednesday nights from 7 to 9, the last Wednesdays of the month. So you can check those out on our website too. And yeah, all my information, email, phone number is there. So if you have any questions,
Awesome.
hit me up.
We'll put it all in at the show notes too, so people have links to everything.
Cool.
Lauren, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I love the information. I think that's going to give people a lot of value. And anybody who is looking for an SLP, look up Lauren. She is wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thanks, Jason.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.